May 1945. Europe lay in ruins. Smoke drifted over German cities. The thunder of guns had finally gone silent. The war that devoured millions was ending, not with heroism, but with surrender and disbelief. Among the last to lay down arms was Klaus Richter, 24, a corporal from Munich. His uniform was threadbare, his boots cracked, and his stomach had long forgotten fullness. He had fought from France to the Rhineland and now marched through his country's wreckage as an American prisoner. To Klaus, capture meant death. Every leaflet and rumor warned that surrendering to the Americans was a sentence of starvation and cruelty. Better to be shot now, he thought bitterly. Beside him trudged Jan Weber, an older sergeant from Hamburg. "Remember your training," Jan murmured. "Speak little. Expect nothing. They'll break us with hunger first." But the first surprise came quickly. The transport train wasn't a cattle car. It had wooden seats, real windows, even guards who looked more like farm boys than executioners. When Klaus asked timidly for water, a freckled American guard handed him a full canteen and even offered a cigarette. Klaus hesitated, expecting mockery, but the guard smiled. "Go on, take it." The flame trembled between them as smoke curled upward like a small truce. Days later, the train reached Camp Shelby, Mississippi, a name that meant nothing to them. The air was heavy with pine and humidity, nothing like war-torn Europe. The camp stretched across rolling land. Rows of barracks, a mess hall, a hospital. The prisoners entered expecting dogs and shouts. Instead, they saw relaxed guards and the faint smell of food. Inside their barracks waited beds, actual beds with sheets. The mess hall smelled of beans, bread, and meat. The first meal was almost holy. Soup rich with vegetables, a slice of buttered bread. Klaus ate slowly, waiting for the blow that never came. When he finished, an American cook grinned. "More?" he asked. Klaus only nodded, too stunned to answer. That night, lying on a soft mattress, Klaus whispered, "Why?" "Because it's a trap," Jan muttered from the bunk above. "They're fattening us up." Yet even he sounded uncertain. Days passed, and the trap never came. Prisoners worked in gardens or kitchens, earning cigarettes or extra rations. When someone fell ill, medics treated him without question. It defied everything they'd been told. One morning, Klaus watched an American nurse tend to a limping German soldier. She changed his bandage gently, smiling as she said, "All better now, honey." He didn't understand her words, but kindness needed no translation. At night, whispers filled the barracks. "They feed us more than our officers ever did," one man said. Another added, "They treat us like men." Still, suspicion clung to them. Cruelty had been their only teacher. But something inside Klaus began to shift. Here, the rhythm was steady. Work, meals, laughter drifting faintly from the guards' quarters. One evening he even caught himself smiling at the sound of a harmonica. The quiet felt dangerous, as if peace were a trick. Then came inspection. The camp commandant, Colonel Harrison, walked among them, grey-haired, weary, but not cruel. "Gentlemen," he said through an interpreter, "you are prisoners, yes, but soldiers too. You will be treated with respect, as we hope our own would be." The words hung in the warm air, impossible yet sincere. Later, Klaus saw the freckled guard again, the one from the train, sharing a sandwich with another soldier. For the first time, Klaus wondered if those men had families waiting, if they missed home as he did. The thought startled him. Am I starting to see them as people? Weeks passed. His body healed, he slept through the night. Yet guilt haunted him. Each meal reminded him of his mother in bombed-out Munich, scavenging for scraps. Each laugh echoed against the silence of friends who would never laugh again. One evening, Jan said quietly, "You're getting comfortable, Klaus. Don't forget who you are." Klaus looked at the darkening sky. Maybe the war forgot who we were long before this. That night, thunder rolled over the Mississippi pines. Klaus sat by the window watching lightning stitch the sky. For the first time since the war began, he felt something dangerous. Hope, or maybe curiosity. What if the world beyond this fence wasn't built entirely on hatred? He didn't know that in a few days he would witness something that would challenge everything he believed, about his captors and about himself. But for that moment, beneath the humid American night, Klaus Richter simply breathed and let the war slip just a little from his shoulders. June 1945. The heavy air of Mississippi clung to everything like a second skin. Days began early at Camp Shelby, the bugle calling prisoners from their bunks long before sunrise. For most German soldiers, it still felt like a cruel trick. The beds were clean, the food was plentiful, the guards polite, too polite. Each act of kindness only deepened their suspicion. No enemy could truly be this merciful. There had to be a hidden cost. Klaus Richter felt this unease every morning as he stood in formation outside the barracks, waiting for roll call. The sun would rise golden over the pine trees, and somewhere beyond the fence, an American soldier would whistle a cheerful tune while pouring coffee into a metal mug. The scent of it made Klaus ache, not just for the drink itself, but for the simple normalcy it represented. The Americans seemed to live in another world, one untouched by hunger, fear, or guilt. Breakfast came with the same surreal consistency, bowls of oatmeal, slices of bread, even jam some mornings. To men who had spent months surviving on black crusts and watery soup, it felt like decadence. "They're softening us up," whispered Jan Weber, always the skeptic. "Make us forget who we are, make us obedient." Klaus wanted to believe that, yet he couldn't explain the way Sergeant Murphy, the kitchen supervisor, always smiled when serving their food. There was no malice in his eyes, only something Klaus hadn't seen since before the war. Simple decency. The camp was run like a small town. There were workshops, a hospital, even a small library with English and German books. Prisoners could volunteer for extra duties, gardening, carpentry, kitchen help, and earn cigarettes or small tokens. Some even wrote home, though every letter passed through censors. Still, even those redacted words carried something powerful, proof that they were alive, being treated humanely, and, impossible as it seemed, respected. The paradox gnawed at Klaus. He had been raised to believe mercy was weakness. The Reich had preached that enemies were to be crushed, not fed. Yet here he was, standing shoulder to shoulder with the supposed monsters who handed him bread and called him son. It was as if the entire war had flipped upside down. One afternoon, Klaus was assigned to assist in the camp infirmary. It was hot and still, the air buzzing with cicadas. Inside, rows of white beds gleamed under sunlight streaming through open windows. A German soldier lay unconscious on one cot, his fever spiking from a shrapnel wound that had gone untreated since capture. An American nurse, pale-skinned, hair tucked neatly under her cap, tended to him with a tenderness that left Klaus wordless. She dabbed his forehead with a damp cloth, humming softly under her breath. When she noticed Klaus watching, she smiled faintly. "He'll be fine," she said, her accent gentle, her tone certain. He didn't understand the words, but he understood her kindness. In that moment, something cracked inside him. He thought of all the faces he'd seen twisted by hate, of officers who had shouted about racial purity and national pride while their soldiers starved in trenches. What made this woman different? What made her care for someone who had come to her country wearing the enemy's uniform? That night, he asked Jan, "What if they truly mean it? What if this is not a trick?" Jan scoffed. "You think they care about us? Don't be naive, Klaus. We're tools. They feed us so we can work." "Then why treat the sick? Why give us books, music, even games?" "Because guilt is fashionable to them," Jan muttered. "They like to believe they're better than us." Klaus said nothing, but doubt lingered. In the evenings, American guards and German prisoners sometimes played soccer on the dusty field beyond the barracks. At first the Germans refused. It seemed humiliating, entertainment for the victors. But curiosity won. Soon laughter echoed across the wire as soldiers who once aimed rifles at each other now kicked a ball through the same patch of dirt. Murphy and the other guards cheered from the sidelines, shouting half-understood encouragement. "Nice kick, Fritz," one called. And though the word Fritz was meant as a joke, the laughter that followed was genuine. Later, in the mess hall, Klaus caught a glimpse of the same guard who'd shouted, now sharing his dessert with a German prisoner who'd scored the winning goal. No cameras, no officers, just two men eating pudding like schoolboys after a game. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. No one knew what to say. Suspicion was still there, but it was losing ground to something more dangerous: trust. In July, Klaus was transferred to kitchen duty, a voluntary post that earned him extra cigarettes. There, he met Sergeant Murphy properly for the first time. Murphy was a big man with kind eyes and hands rough from years of farm work. He treated the kitchen like a sacred space, clean, organized, full of purpose. "If a man's got to be far from home," Murphy said one day, "the least he deserves is a good meal." Klaus learned to chop vegetables, scrub pots, and even bake simple rolls under Murphy's watch. He noticed how Murphy spoke to everyone the same: guard or prisoner, black or white, officer or cook. It was equality made flesh, something Klaus had been taught could never exist. One afternoon, when Klaus burned his hand lifting a hot tray, Murphy immediately fetched a cloth and bandaged it himself. "Careful, son," he said. "That'll sting tomorrow." "Danke," Klaus muttered, and though Murphy didn't understand the word, he nodded as if he did. Outside, summer thunder rolled across the Mississippi sky. Rain swept over the camp, soaking the ground, cooling the air. From the window of the kitchen, Klaus watched the storm break over the pine forest beyond the fence. The lightning illuminated the guards' watchtowers for brief, blinding moments, and in those flashes, the barbed wire didn't seem like a cage, just a line drawn between two worlds that were slowly learning to see each other. That night, when the rain stopped and the smell of wet earth filled the barracks, Klaus heard someone humming a tune. It took him a moment to recognize it. Silent Night, the German carol he'd sung as a child. Someone, perhaps an American soldier, was whistling it outside. The melody floated through the darkness, haunting and strangely peaceful. For the first time since his capture, Klaus felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't suspicion. It was hope. Fragile, uncertain, but real. And though he didn't know it yet, that hope would soon collide with a miracle so profound it would echo for generations. For even as summer faded into winter, the Americans at Camp Shelby were planning something that would forever change the lives of every man behind those fences. December 1945. The war had been over for months, but its shadow still stretched across the hearts of the men inside Camp Shelby. Winter in Mississippi was mild, yet the cold that lived inside Klaus Richter was not the kind that came from the air. It was the weight of memory, the cries of dying comrades, the smoke over Munich, the faces of men who would never see peace. Even surrounded by warmth and routine, that past clung to him like frost on glass. Still, life inside the camp had changed. What had begun as cautious coexistence between captor and captive was slowly transforming into something unthinkable: understanding. Klaus now worked full-time in the kitchen, a place that had become almost holy to him. There, amid the hiss of boiling pots and the rhythm of knives on chopping boards, he found a strange comfort. It was a small world ruled by routine, order, and the steady voice of Sergeant Murphy, whose humor filled every corner like sunlight. That morning, Klaus noticed something unusual. Trucks began arriving from the nearby town, unloading crates so large it took 3 men to move each one. He wiped his hands on his apron and stared as boxes of apples, sacks of flour, and massive frozen birds were carried into the cold storage room. Murphy was barking orders with an energy Klaus had never seen before. "What is all this?" Klaus asked in his careful English, his accent thick but improving. Murphy glanced over his shoulder, smiling. "Christmas, son. Big dinner coming up. We're feeding everyone." Klaus frowned. "Everyone? You mean—" Murphy nodded. "Everyone. Guards, cooks, prisoners. A proper Christmas dinner." The words didn't make sense. "But we are prisoners, and we're all human," Murphy replied matter-of-factly, turning back to his clipboard. Klaus stood frozen, his mind refusing to believe it. In the German army, prisoners were fed the scraps, if anything at all. He'd watched captured Russians starve while their guards laughed. To imagine Americans doing the opposite, sharing their own feast with the men who had tried to kill them, was madness. Surely this was some sort of psychological trick. Over the next days, the kitchen transformed into a hive of activity. Turkeys thawed in sinks. Pots of gravy simmered slowly. Boxes of potatoes were peeled and stacked in mountains that reached Klaus's chest. The sweet scent of apples and sugar filled the air as pies were baked in endless rows. Murphy moved from station to station like a general before battle, his sleeves rolled high, his face glistening with sweat. "Keep the mash creamy, not lumpy," he shouted to the younger cooks. Then, glancing at Klaus, he grinned. "You Germans like precision, right? That's why I trust you with the stuffing." Klaus obeyed silently, his hands steady even though his mind was in turmoil. Around him, laughter and Christmas music from a small radio filled the kitchen. The American cooks sang along to Bing Crosby, their voices blending with the sounds of chopping and sizzling. At first, Klaus tried to ignore it, but soon he found himself humming softly under his breath, just the melody, no words. When Murphy noticed, he gave a wink. "That's the spirit, son." Each day brought new surprises. On the 21st, crates of milk and cream arrived, followed by barrels labeled cranberries. Klaus had never seen cranberries before. Their bright red color gleamed like jewels under the kitchen lights. Murphy explained how they would be cooked with sugar to make a sauce. "You'll like it," he promised. "Tart and sweet at the same time, just like life." That night, Klaus returned to the barracks and described what he'd seen. The reaction was predictable. "They're mocking us," Jan Weber muttered, shaking his head. "They'll make us watch the meat, then throw us the scraps." "Maybe," Klaus said quietly, though the words lacked conviction. He couldn't forget the way Murphy had spoken. There had been no cruelty, only warmth. On the 22nd, the camp was decorated. Pine branches were strung along the mess hall walls, their resin scent mingling with the aroma of roasting meat. Prisoners and guards worked side by side, crafting paper ornaments from whatever materials they could find. Newspaper, foil from ration packs, bits of string. An American guard handed Klaus a strip of colored paper and gestured for him to join. Klaus hesitated, but then began folding the pieces into rings, forming a chain. For a few minutes, the war outside the wire felt impossibly distant. Murphy came by in the afternoon, his arms full of supplies. "You know, Richter," he said, using Klaus's name for the first time, "I had a friend back home, a farmer like me. He said if you want to keep the peace, feed people. Hard to fight on a full stomach." Klaus looked up from his work. "Did he fight in the war?" Murphy nodded. "Sure did. Pacific. He didn't make it back. So this Christmas I figure we feed as many souls as we can. Maybe that's how we make sense of it all." The words sank deep. For the first time, Klaus saw not a guard, but a man carrying his own ghosts. As the final preparations continued, whispers spread among the prisoners. Some claimed the feast was a trick to gather them in one place. Others insisted it was propaganda, to make Americans look good. But Klaus had seen the sincerity in Murphy's eyes, the quiet joy of the men cooking beside him. He began to believe something extraordinary was coming. By December 23rd, the mess hall was transformed. The tables were scrubbed and lined up end to end, enough for 800 men. Hand-cut stars hung from the ceiling, catching the light like frost. A tall tree stood in one corner, its decoration simple but beautiful. Even the guards seemed lighter, their usual strictness replaced by something gentler. That evening, Murphy pulled Klaus aside. "Tomorrow night," he said softly, "you'll see something worth remembering. Be here early." Klaus nodded, unable to speak. When he returned to the barracks, Jan was waiting. "They've brainwashed you, haven't they?" he sneered. Klaus didn't argue. He simply lay down, staring at the wooden ceiling above him. Outside, the night was still, the air scented with pine and distant wood smoke. He thought of home, of his mother lighting candles in their old apartment, of the Christmases before the war, before everything had turned to ash. For the first time in years, Klaus whispered a prayer. Not for victory or survival, but for understanding. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, the faint sounds of laughter and clinking dishes from the kitchen carried through the cold night air, promising something he dared not believe in, peace. He would wake the next evening to witness a miracle that would change him forever. December 24th, 1945. The Mississippi sky burned orange as dusk settled over Camp Shelby. Whispers had filled the air all day, Something extraordinary was coming. The German prisoners doubted every rumor, propaganda, interrogation, punishment. Yet as the bells struck 6, reality defied them all. The mess hall glowed with warm light. Strands of tiny bulbs shimmered overhead, reflecting on clean windows. The smell reached them first: roast turkey, honeyed ham, potatoes and pie. It was the scent of home, not prison. Klaus Richter stepped inside, heart hammering. His boots clicked on polished wood as he froze before a sight beyond belief. Evergreens lined the beams. Paper and foil ornaments sparkled overhead. In the corner stood a tall Christmas tree, its lights flickering like captured stars. 800 German prisoners stood silent, staring at tables laid with real plates and silverware. No tin trays, no barked orders, just a simple word from a smiling guard. Sit. Klaus hesitated. Sergeant Murphy caught his eye and said gently, "Go on, son, it's Christmas." Slowly Klaus sat. Before him lay turkey steaming with gravy, potatoes rich with butter, green beans, cranberry sauce, a soft roll, and even apple pie. The room fell still as Colonel Harrison stepped forward. "Gentlemen," he said, voice calm and firm, "tonight we honor the birth of Christ, the one who taught us to love our enemies. You are our guests this evening. Please eat." The interpreter's German echoed through the hall. For a long moment no one moved, until Jan Weber, Klaus's hardened sergeant, lifted his fork, tasted, and whispered, "Mein Gott, it's real." The spell broke. Cutlery clinked, men laughed and cried. Klaus took his first bite, and warmth flooded through him. For years food had been survival. Tonight it was memory, of family, of peace, of being human. Around him, faces softened, soldiers became sons again. Then something even stranger happened. The American soldiers sat beside them. Plates were passed, coffee poured. A young private named Thompson offered Klaus a slice of pie. "Apple," he said slowly. "You like?" Klaus nodded, voice trembling. "Ja, like home." He pulled a worn photograph from his pocket, his sister in Munich, smiling before the bombs. Thompson showed him a picture of a girl in Ohio. They didn't share words, but the meaning was clear: family. At another table, Murphy laughed as he taught Germans the English words to Silent Night. They sang it back, Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The melodies merged into one haunting harmony. The rafters trembled with it, a fragile bridge across a broken world. Klaus watched through tears, the glow of lights, the hum of laughter. It felt like a dream. He turned to Murphy. "Why do this for us?" he asked softly. "We are your enemies." Murphy smiled, weary but kind. "Because it's Christmas," he said, "and somebody's got to start treating people like people again." When the plates were cleared, Colonel Harrison returned. "We have one more gift," he said. "Paper, envelopes, pencils. Write your families. Tell them you're safe. Tell them Merry Christmas." Klaus stared at the blank sheet. Around him, pens began to scratch softly. He thought of his mother in ruined Munich and began to write. "Dearest Mama, you will not believe what I tell you. Tonight, the Americans gave us a Christmas feast. Turkey, butter, even pie. They sat beside us as friends. We sang together. I don't understand this war anymore. If these are our enemies, what does that make us?" Tears blurred the ink, but he kept writing. All around him, hundreds of letters took shape, messages that would travel through the ashes of Germany, carrying the truth of mercy. When the hall grew quiet again, no one wanted to leave. The hum of lights filled the silence. No shouts, no orders, only peace. Outside, snow began to fall, rare and soft for Mississippi. It drifted over the camp roofs, melting on the warm earth. Klaus folded his letter and looked around. The faces near him no longer looked like prisoners or guards. They looked like men saved, if only for one night, by grace. And as he sat there, a strange thought settled in his heart. If mercy can feel like this, why had the world chosen hate for so long? He didn't know it then, but that question would follow him all his life, and quietly begin to change the world. December 25th, 1945. Dawn came soft and golden, settling over Camp Shelby like a benediction. Klaus Richter woke to quiet laughter, and for a moment thought the feast, the songs, the mercy of last night had been a dream. Then he smelled it. Fresh coffee, rich and sweet. He sat up in disbelief. Breakfast was waiting. Not thin porridge, but pancakes, scrambled eggs, and crisp bacon shining with maple syrup. Behind the counter stood Sergeant Murphy, grinning. "Merry Christmas, boys," he called. The prisoners stared. Klaus whispered, "It wasn't a dream." They ate in near silence, afraid to break the spell. Even Jan Weber, the hardened skeptic, smiled faintly. "If this is captivity," he muttered, "maybe I don't want to be free." But the true miracle came after breakfast. When the men returned to their barracks, each found a small parcel on his bunk, writing paper, envelopes, a pencil, and a note in English and German, "Write home. Tell them you are well." No one moved at first. Then one by one they sat, unfolding the paper with trembling hands. For months they had lived cut off from the world, unsure if their families even survived. Now they were being offered something more precious than food: connection. Klaus stared at the blank page. What could he possibly say? He imagined his mother in ruined Munich, sleeping in a basement, clutching his photo. Slowly he began to write. "Dearest Mama, I know you will not believe what I tell you, but last night the Americans gave us a Christmas feast. Turkey, butter, apple pie. They sat beside us as equals. They sang with us. I have seen kindness where I expected cruelty. I no longer understand this war." Tears blurred his writing. Around him others did the same. The soft scrape of pencils became a fragile music, the sound of reconciliation. Jan wrote to his wife in Hamburg, "My beloved Liesel, I am ashamed to tell you I am warm, well-fed, and treated with dignity by our enemies. The Americans have shown me more kindness in one night than our own commanders did in 4 years." Another man wrote simply, "They feed us like brothers, not prisoners." When guards collected the letters, they promised they would be mailed. For once the prisoners believed them. A small, miraculous trust had taken root. That evening, the camp was quieter than ever. Men reread their words, whispering them aloud as if hearing their family's answer. Klaus imagined his mother's tears of disbelief, and her hope. "My son lives. He has found mercy among strangers." Weeks later came the news. The letters had been sent. Joy swept the camp. For the first time, their voices would cross the ocean, carrying truth into a shattered Germany. When those letters arrived, they did more damage to lies than any bomb. Mothers wept, wives clutched the pages, and children asked, "If the Americans are so kind, why did we call them monsters?" German officials, reading intercepted copies, were unsettled. Reports labeled the Americans' mercy a psychological weapon. One officer wrote, "Their kindness is the most dangerous tactic they possess." Inside Camp Shelby, life changed. Guards greeted men by name, not number. Rules remained, but voices softened. The prisoners stood taller, worked with pride, and smiled without fear. Hope had become routine, yet with hope came guilt. At night, Klaus lay awake, haunted by memories of how his army had treated others. Russian captives beaten, civilians starved. He thought of the hatred he'd believed in, and it burned inside him. "Maybe mercy is harder than war," he whispered one night. "Mercy doesn't win wars," Jan answered. "Maybe that's why it's powerful," Klaus replied softly. Winter melted into spring. The pines turned green again. Gardens bloomed where barbed wire once seemed menacing. Klaus worked beside an American farmer named Peterson, trading words, blue, blau, and laughter that needed no translation. What began as a night of grace had become a quiet revolution. By early 1946, rumors of repatriation spread. Men dreamed of homecomings, though none knew what waited beyond the ocean. For Klaus, home had changed. It was no longer just Munich. It was the humanity he'd rediscovered here, inside his enemy's camp. But peace would not last untouched. News from Europe soon reached Mississippi. Truths of the death camps, of atrocities too vast to fathom. When those horrors came to light, every letter of gratitude the prisoners had written carried a new weight. The words that once described mercy now echoed with shame. Klaus read his own letter again, feeling the sting of contradiction. How could he have received such kindness when his own nation had shown none? He looked toward the fading sun beyond the fence and whispered, "Maybe that's the point. Someone had to break the cycle." And as spring deepened over Camp Shelby, Klaus understood at last what mercy truly was. Not weakness, but rebellion against hate itself. Spring, 1946. The Mississippi sun beat down on the roofs of Camp Shelby, yet inside the barracks a cold stillness lingered. It began as whispers, rumors from guards, fragments of headlines glimpsed during kitchen duty, faint radio voices the prisoners weren't meant to hear. Something terrible had been uncovered in Europe, something that left even the victors silent. Klaus Richter felt the shift before he understood it. The guards who once smiled now spoke little. Officers huddled around radios at night, their faces grave. One morning, Sergeant Murphy washed his hands again and again, as though scrubbing away something unseen. Klaus finally asked, "What is happening, Sergeant?" Murphy hesitated. "They're showing films," he said softly. "From Germany, from the camps." "Camps?" Klaus echoed, puzzled. Murphy looked at him, eyes clouded with sorrow. "You'll see soon enough." A week later, the entire camp was ordered to the recreation hall. Expecting another lecture, the prisoners sat quietly as the lights dimmed. The film began, grainy, silent at first. Rows of barbed wire, skeletal figures in striped rags, hollow eyes staring at nothing. Then the narrator's voice, steady yet trembling. "These are the concentration camps of Germany, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen." Gasps rippled through the room. On-screen bulldozers pushed piles of corpses into mass graves. American soldiers handed food to survivors too weak to stand. Someone sobbed, another retched. Klaus sat rigid, his hands white on the bench, his stomach turned to ice. This can't be real, he thought, but the faces were real. Jews, Poles, Russians, even Germans. The narrator said millions were dead, millions. When the lights came up, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating. Years of lies, of purity, progress, destiny, collapsed in an instant. What they had called civilization was slaughter. What they had called order was murder. That night, Klaus found Jan Weber sitting outside, staring into the dark. "You saw it, Jan." Whispered. "You saw what we did." Klaus could only nod. "They said it was lies," Jan said bitterly. "Enemy propaganda. And I believed them. God help me, I believed them. While we ate turkey in Mississippi, they were burning children." Klaus sat beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, he said, "Maybe that's why they showed us mercy, to remind us what being human looks like." Jan buried his face in his hands and wept. In the days that followed, the camp was heavy with shame. The laughter that once filled the mess hall vanished. Even Murphy seemed older. One night, finding Klaus scrubbing pots long past curfew, he rested a hand on his shoulder. "We can't undo it," he said quietly, "but we can choose what happens next." Klaus looked up. "How can you forgive us?" Murphy shook his head. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give, but mercy, that's something we can all choose." Weeks passed. The prisoners were given newspapers and reports from the Nuremberg trials. Names, Göring, Himmler, Eichmann, stared up like ghosts. Some denied everything, others raged, but most were simply broken. The foundation of their world had crumbled. The uniforms they'd once worn with pride now felt like ash. One afternoon, Colonel Harrison assembled them in the yard. His voice was calm but heavy. "You've seen what your leaders did," he said through the interpreter. "You may ask why we treated you with kindness when your nation showed none. The answer is simple. Mercy isn't earned, it's given. Someone must choose to end the cycle of cruelty. We chose to be those people." When he stepped away, men wept openly. Klaus felt something break within him, something he had carried for years. He finally understood kindness was not weakness. It was the only true strength left in a broken world. That night, he wrote again to his mother, "Dearest Mama, I have seen things no soul should see. I do not know how to pray for forgiveness, but I will try to live differently. The Americans have shown us what it means to be human again. The world cannot be rebuilt with hate." He folded the letter carefully, unsure if it would ever reach her. Yet writing it felt like a confession, a reclaiming of his soul. In the weeks that followed, the camp changed once more. Lessons on history, democracy, and ethics began. German books filled the library. Men debated, questioned, thought freely for the first time in years. Slowly, obedience gave way to understanding. Still, the memories of the film haunted Klaus's dreams. The silent faces, the endless pits. Yet beneath that horror lived another memory, a hand offering pie, a guard singing Silent Night, a meal where enemies became men again. That contrast pierced him, yet healed him too. Between cruelty and compassion, he finally understood what humanity truly was. By summer, the world outside Camp Shelby was rebuilding. Inside, another kind of reconstruction had begun, the rebuilding of souls. And though Klaus did not yet know it, that transformation would shape everything that followed, his return to Germany, his future, and the fragile peace rising from the ashes. August 1946. The cicadas sang in the Mississippi heat, and the scent of pine and soil hung heavy over Camp Shelby. For over a year, Klaus Richter had lived behind its fences, once a cage, now a sanctuary. Here he had rediscovered something he thought war had killed, his own humanity. But peace, like all gifts, could not last. Repatriation orders had arrived. Germany wanted its sons back, and America was ready to let them go. Klaus stood in the vegetable garden he had tended for months, rows of beans and tomatoes shimmering under the sun. Across from him, Peterson, the Iowa farmer who supervised the garden, leaned on his shovel. "You've got good hands, Richter," he said. "Better than some of my boys back home." Klaus smiled. "You teach well." His English, shaped by months of quiet work and long talks, flowed easily now. Peterson often spoke of county fairs, harvests, and the endless cornfields of Iowa. Those stories had become Klaus's window into a gentler world, one built on labor and decency, not fear. As they gathered the last ripe tomatoes, Peterson said, "When you get home, come to Iowa sometime. I'll show you how to grow real corn." Klaus paused. "You would welcome a German soldier to your farm?" Peterson shrugged. "You're not my enemy anymore." Then, after a moment, maybe you never really were. That night, the prisoners packed their few belongings, cigarettes, notebooks, worn letters. Klaus folded the last one from his mother, its paper soft from use. Around him, men spoke quietly of what awaited them beyond the ocean. None knew for sure what home meant anymore. The next morning, trucks rumbled outside the gates. Murphy stood beside the convoy, clipboard in hand. He greeted each man by name, his voice firm though his eyes betrayed sadness. When Klaus approached, Murphy offered his hand. "You take care of yourself, son." Klaus hesitated, then gripped it tightly. "You changed me," he said. Murphy shook his head. "Nah, you changed yourself. We just gave you the chance." As the trucks pulled away, Klaus looked back through the dust and wire. The pine trees shimmered green in the sun. Behind those fences he had found mercy. Ahead lay ruins and responsibility. The voyage home was long and restless. The Atlantic rolled grey and endless beneath a sky that refused to clear. Some men spoke of families they prayed were alive. Others sat in silence, haunted by what awaited them. When the ship finally docked in Bremerhaven, the sight struck like a blow. The harbour was a graveyard of twisted cranes and shattered warehouses. Smoke still drifted over the rubble of cities that no longer existed. The air smelled of coal and sorrow. Klaus stepped onto the dock, his chest tight. This was home, stripped of everything but memory. Munich was worse. Districts flattened into wasteland, streets lined with hollow-eyed refugees. His family's apartment on Schillerstrasse was gone, nothing but blackened stone. He found his mother living in a damp basement with 12 others. Her hair was grey, her hands trembled when she opened the door. "You're alive," she whispered. "They said all prisoners were dead." Klaus held her close. "No, Mama, I lived. The Americans, they cared for us." She frowned, confused. "The Americans? The ones who bombed us?" "Yes," he said softly. "Those same men." He told her of Camp Shelby, the feast, the letters, the kindness. When he finished, she wept quietly. "Then maybe," she whispered, "God still remembers us." In the weeks that followed, Klaus searched for work amid the ruins. Factories were gone, but the Americans were rebuilding bridges and railways. He found a job with a US engineering unit repairing the Isar bridges. His supervisor, Captain Williams, was easygoing, sunburned, and kind. "You were at Camp Shelby?" Williams asked one afternoon. Klaus nodded. "Good place," Williams said. "I trained there before the war. Colonel Harrison ran it right. Fair man." Klaus smiled faintly. "He was our commandant. He gave us our first Christmas." Williams chuckled. "Then you met one of the best men I know." As the months passed, Klaus worked side by side with Americans who once would have shot him. Now they shared coffee and jokes. Each bridge they rebuilt felt symbolic, connections between worlds that had sworn each other enemies. Yet the real rebuilding was within. The lessons of Camp Shelby became his compass. He volunteered with American relief groups, translating, distributing food, helping organize cultural exchanges. His knowledge of English made him a bridge between occupier and occupied, between guilt and renewal. Soon, his work drew notice from local officials. By late 1947, he was coordinating reconstruction efforts across Bavaria. When American administrators asked him to help rebuild schools and libraries, he accepted. It felt like redemption. Sometimes, at dusk, he sat by the river and remembered that Mississippi night, the glow of lights, the songs, the warmth of pie and forgiveness. He realized what the Americans had offered wasn't just food or freedom, but a vision of what the world could be if men refused to hate. By 1948, Klaus was traveling between cities under the Marshall Plan, helping move relief shipments. When the Berlin airlift began, he volunteered to assist the operation. He met American pilots who remembered men like Murphy and farmers from Iowa now flying food to starving families. One of them laughed and said, "Funny, isn't it? We fed you back then, and now we're feeding your whole country." Klaus smiled. "And maybe this time we'll all stay fed." The years ahead would be hard, rebuilding, reconciling, remembering. But he had learned that peace was not a treaty, it was a daily choice. Every handshake, every act of mercy, every refusal to hate was a brick in the new world they were building together. That Christmas night in camp, Shelby had not just saved 800 prisoners. It had planted something deeper, seeds of humanity that would outlive the war. And as Klaus walked through the reborn streets of Munich, hearing laughter again where once there had been silence, he knew what he had become. Not a soldier, not a survivor, a witness to the truth that even after humanity's darkest hour, men could still choose the light. Autumn 1948. Europe was stirring back to life. The ruins still stood, black and skeletal, but between them new walls rose, new roads reached toward a fragile future. Germany was no longer a nation of conquerors, but of survivors and builders clawing their way from ashes. Among them was Klaus Richter, once a prisoner of war, now a man whose purpose had outgrown his past. In the 3 years since his return, Klaus had become known in Munich as the man who spoke the language of both sides. Fluent in English, calm in bearing, he worked with the American occupation authorities rebuilding schools, hospitals, and bridges. Yet his true labor was quieter, restoring dignity. He carried Camp Shelby in his heart like a small, steady flame. When cynics sneered at the Americans, he told them of the Christmas feast. The night guards and prisoners sang together and remembered what it meant to be human. At first, few believed him, but Klaus never stopped telling the story. "It was real," he would say gently. "I was there. I tasted it." He told it to school children, sitting among broken desks, to old men still wrapped in defeat, even to weary American officers who sometimes forgot why they remained. His story reminded them all that peace was not just a treaty. It was respect. That same year, a visitor arrived from across the ocean, Sergeant Murphy, older now, carrying a walking stick and the same warmth Klaus remembered. They met in the reconstructed Marienplatz, where bells rang over scaffolding and pigeons wheeled through the autumn sky. "Would you look at that?" Murphy said, admiring the half-rebuilt city. "You folks sure don't quit." Klaus smiled. "We had good teachers." Murphy chuckled and clasped his shoulder. "You're proof we did something right. I told my wife I was coming to see an old prisoner. She said, 'That's a strange vacation.' I told her it's the best kind. They shared lunch at a small cafe, black bread, cheese, apples, simple food eaten with gratitude. Murphy listened as Klaus described his work rebuilding trust between Germans and Americans. When Klaus finished, Murphy said quietly, "You know what I learned that night back in 45? Feeding people is the most powerful weapon in the world, not because it makes them weak, but because it makes them human again." Those words stayed with Klaus forever. They became the heart of every program he built. When the Marshall Plan began, he ensured Bavaria's aid went to schools and libraries, not weapons. When the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in 1949, he declared publicly, nations must break bread before they can sign peace. By the early 1950s, Germany had transformed. Markets buzzed, children played where craters once yawned, and though scars remained, gratitude did too. The Christmas letters from Camp Shelby had found their way into history books, studied as the first flicker of moral renewal. Yet to Klaus, it was never history. It was memory, alive and breathing. Every December, he wrote to Murphy in Florida. Their letters were simple: family news, harvests, reflections. In 1955, on the 10th anniversary of the feast, Klaus sent a photograph of his young son beside a Christmas tree. On the back he wrote, "His name is Thomas. I named him after you, so he will remember kindness before cruelty." Murphy replied, "You've done more for peace than all the generals put together." Their friendship endured for decades. In 1960, when Klaus traveled to America for a Reconstruction conference, Murphy met him at the airport in a worn brown suit and a wide grin. They spent 3 days driving through Iowa's golden fields. Klaus met Peterson, the farmer who had once taught him to garden behind barbed wire. They drank coffee on a porch as fireflies drifted through the dusk. "See?" Peterson said, gesturing toward the endless cornfields. "Told you we grow them tall here." In that moment, Klaus felt the invisible bridge between their worlds, built not by treaties, but by ordinary people who had chosen compassion over vengeance. When he returned to Germany, he devoted himself to education. He founded student exchange programs, sending young Germans to study in America. Later, he created a small foundation called Humanity First, dedicated to reconciliation between former enemies. Its motto was simple: to understand is to heal. The idea spread quickly. By the late 1960s, hundreds of students were crossing oceans not to fight wars, but to learn peace. At home, Klaus raised his children on stories, not of battles, but of kindness. On winter nights, as snow drifted outside, he told them of the Christmas in Mississippi, the glow of lights, the harmony of carols, the food that tasted like forgiveness. "Remember," he would say, "our family's freedom was fed to us on Christmas plates." His daughter Ingrid later wrote, "My father never spoke of enemies, only of people who had forgotten they were the same." By the 1970s, the world had changed again. The Cold War divided nations, but Germany stood free and strong beside its former foes. When tensions rose, Klaus would quietly remind his colleagues, "We've seen worse, and we've seen better." When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Klaus was an old man. Watching on television as East and West embraced under falling concrete, he wrote one final letter to Murphy's widow. "Dear Margaret," he wrote, "when I saw the wall come down, I thought of your husband. I remembered his voice in that camp kitchen, saying mercy is the strongest weapon. Tonight I know he was right. Because mercy built this peace, not bombs. He fed us, and we fed the future." Klaus lived to see a new Germany, prosperous, democratic, and whole. When he died in 2006, his funeral bore both German and American flags. Among the mourners were diplomats, soldiers, and farmers whose lives his story had touched. On his casket rested a single folded letter, yellowed with age, the one he had written to his mother in 1945. "Dearest Mama, I know you will not believe what I am about to tell you." That letter had begun everything. It had carried truth across a broken world, and its echo had never faded. Klaus Richter's life became proof that the simplest act, a shared meal, could change history. His story was told in classrooms and pulpits, yet for those who knew him, it was not about glory, it was about faith in people, in decency, in the fragile miracle of peace. And every Christmas, somewhere in Germany and somewhere in America, families still set an extra plate at the table, a quiet tribute to the night enemies became friends over turkey and apple pie. Because the real legacy of mercy, Klaus once wrote, is not carved in stone or medals. It lives in the choices we make every day. The choice to forgive, to listen, to feed instead of fight. And as long as those choices continue, the miracle of that Christmas in 1945 will never end. Winter 2006. Snow blanketed Munich in a quiet, forgiving white. Inside a small house on the city's edge, an old man sat by the window, his hands trembling as he held a pen. Klaus Richter, 89, wrote his last letter. The fire crackled behind him, a clock ticked softly. On the table lay a page half filled, ink faint where his hand had paused, as though memory itself had slowed. He wrote to his grandchildren. They knew him as a gentle man who smiled at Christmas, who never let anyone eat alone, who spoke of peace instead of war. But they did not know the ghosts behind those smiles, the weight he carried from a camp in Mississippi 60 years before. He dipped his pen again. My dear ones, I have lived long enough to see enemies become friends, to see peace grow where hate once ruled. But I must tell you why kindness matters more than victory, and mercy more than strength. He looked out at the snow. It reminded him of another night, Christmas Eve, 1945. The lights, the songs, the smell of turkey. It had never left him. That night, he wrote, I learned mercy is not earned, it is given. We were prisoners, defeated, yet the Americans fed us like brothers. They showed me that decency is stronger than vengeance. That truth carried me through every dark day after. On the mantel stood a faded photograph, himself, Murphy and Peterson, their hands stained with garden soil. None could have imagined how far that small act of kindness would reach. When Klaus returned to Germany, that lesson guided everything, every handshake, every rebuilt bridge. He saw it echoed in the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, the fall of the wall. All of it, in some way, began with that single act of grace, a Christmas feast shared among enemies. He remembered speaking at a Berlin university in the 1970s, before students angry at America. You think you know the cruelty of war, he told them. I have seen it. But I have also seen compassion. When your enemy feeds you, you can no longer call him your enemy. And then the world begins to heal. The hall had fallen silent. Now, near life's end, Klaus wondered if the world still remembered. War still burned elsewhere, old fears reborn. Yet he believed the lesson endured. You will live in a world where kindness may seem weak, he wrote. But remember, cruelty wins battles, kindness wins centuries. There is no victory in breaking an enemy, only in turning one into a friend. Feed people, listen to them, share your table. That is how peace begins. His hand trembled as he signed the final lines. If a man like me, who once believed in hate, could learn this, then anyone can. The greatest battle is not between nations, but between mercy and fear. Choose mercy. He set the pen down. Outside, snow drifted like quiet blessings. The letter was found 2 days later. At his funeral, attended by both German and American officials, it was read aloud by his eldest granddaughter. His coffin, draped in a German flag, was flanked by 2 soldiers, one Bundeswehr, one US Army, standing side by side. In the front row sat the descendants of men who had once guarded him at Camp Shelby. After the service, an American colonel placed a card on the coffin. It read, "Feeding people is the strongest weapon ever invented." Years passed, and Klaus's story spread. It was told in schools, films, and sermons, but its truest legacy lived quietly. Across Germany, families began hosting peace dinners each December, inviting strangers and rivals to share a meal. Schools held Shelby nights, teaching how kindness could end wars. In 2015, on the 70th anniversary of that Christmas, descendants of guards and prisoners gathered at the restored Camp Shelby. Tables stood beneath strings of lights. They ate turkey and apple pie. Someone brought out a harmonica, and soon the same carol rose once more. Silent Night, half in English, half in German. Among them was Thomas Richter, Klaus's grandson. As he looked around, Americans, Germans, once enemies, he felt his grandfather's truth like a heartbeat. Mercy had not vanished, it had only changed form. Later, as candles flickered, Thomas read from the final letter, "Peace is not built by those who hold power, but by those who hold compassion. It begins when one person decides the cycle of hate ends with them." Silence followed, then gentle applause. Outside, snow began to fall over Mississippi, rare and fleeting. The flakes melted on the warm hands of those who had once been strangers. And somewhere beyond time, in the stillness that follows forgiveness, Klaus Richter's spirit smiled. He had lived and died to prove one eternal truth: mercy, once given, never dies. It travels through generations, carried by stories, by memories, by every small kindness that defies cruelty. Because the victory of that Christmas night in 1945 was never the feast or the song. It was the understanding that compassion, once chosen, can echo through the centuries. And as long as someone, somewhere, still chooses to feed instead of fight, the world will never be truly lost.